Hello, friends. You ask for sequel, and we prepare it. Today we have America back on the line. Mitchell Jones, who is historian and activist from Rochester. He has a bachelor degree in anthropology and a master's degree in history from the college at Brockport, State University of New York. His research interests include early America, religion, sects, working class institutions, labor history, abolitionism, and the American Civil War. Today we will discuss with Mitchell Jones the topic of Russia is special military operation in Ukraine, the attitude of American society and in particular American communists to what is happening. Background: how did the American society, government, and media assess the events in Ukraine in 2013?
To talk about, the tension between the U.S. and Russia, obviously 1991 is a logical starting point, but I don't even really want to go that far back. I know we could zoom out all the way into the 18th century and the history of Russia's relationship with Ukraine, but I think the contemporary history is what's important here. So after the fall of the Soviet Union in 91, there were thinkers who were developing neoliberalism, like Milton Friedman and others, that were saying that we were going to have an American century. The 21st century was going to be an American century because America was unchecked in the world. America was the only global superpower. However, starting in the 2000s, Russia, taking a capitalist road, began to recover its economy and began to recover its position in the world. It continued to be the second biggest nuclear weapons state, started to have mutually beneficial relationships with China. And so this recovery is really the cause of the tensions between the United States and Russia. In 1991, NATO consisted of 16 member states, but since then it's added 14 countries, mostly former Soviet republics. But, some people in the West have said, well, how can you say it's NATO's fault for this invasion, which I do think NATO is the primary one to blame, although I don't agree with Putin's decision to invade sovereign territory. But NATO is not merely a defensive alliance. In fact, NATO has drawn its member states into wars and occupations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yugoslavia. It bombed Yugoslavia. That was one of the early things that NATO did. So in the U.S. interest in Ukraine was really clear in September 2013. The famous palace in Yalta in Crimea, where Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill had met, a group of Ukraine's oligarchs met with many powerful people. Bill and Hillary Clinton, former CIA director, General Petraeus, and many other people. So the idea of this conference was to develop what they called the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. So fine. And I should mention both President Viktor Yanukovych and his successor, Petro Poroshenko, were at this Yalta conference in 2013 as well. Now that's the end. That's September 2013. In 2014 was when the color revolution in Ukraine happened. So there were people in the streets. The Maidan protest, I think many people saw it as legitimate. Many people saw Yanukovych as corrupt. However, it was quickly taken over by the fascists, because the fascists were the most organized, most militant groups in Ukraine at the time. So the Obama administration supported the Maidan revolution in the deeply divided Ukraine and used neo-Nazi military forces to overthrow Yanukovych. Yanukovych, I should mention too, he wanted to play a centrist position between Russia and the European Union. He wasn't a totally 100%, 100% Russia guy. But the United States had actually been involved in a cyber war against Russia since 2012. And so when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, the officials at the Pentagon actually decided to conceal details of the cyber operation against Russia from the president, Donald Trump, at the time. The Democrats also focused on this Russophobia thing, this Russiagate. They called it Russiagate. And it was this idea that Donald Trump had colluded with Putin and other, Russian powerful people to cheat in the election of 2016 in order to win. Now, instead of opposing Trump's racist bigotry, his anti-worker ideas, any number of things you could have criticized Trump for, they chose to go for this Russophobia thing, right? They chose to go for the hate, to direct the hate at a foreign enemy, and so many people, especially people that considered themselves liberal and progressives, traditionally may have been sort of more dovish, more anti-war, became cheerleaders of the central institutions of capitalist power, like the FBI, like the CIA. The film director Spike Lee appeared on television with a shirt that said, "God bless Robert Mueller." Robert Mueller was the head of the FBI at the time, who was investigating, eventually the result of Mueller's investigation was that he found that there wasn't collusion between Trump and the Russian government. So the result of this, though, was that Trump, before the election, said that he wanted to have diplomacy with Russia. He wanted to talk things out with Putin. After the election, after this Russiagate campaign went in full force, Trump was hostile towards Russia. So it had a profound effect on his policies. So, I mean, the critical flashpoints were in Syria and Ukraine. So, in 2019, the Trump administration withdrew from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which had been part of nuclear non-proliferation between Russia and NATO since 1997, and started up this arms war again. So we've also seen on the home front here in the United States a war in the media against Russia. So we've seen a lot of propaganda. So since the invasion of Ukraine in February, Russian restaurants have been attacked. People aren't going to Russian restaurants. Many of the owners of these restaurants are from Ukraine, you know, the people calling them traitors, right? And these are Ukrainian people. They're not even Russian, right? But just because they own a Russian restaurant. There was a movie that came out in 2014 called Equalizer, an action film, and the chief Russian villain is named Vladimir Pushkin. Sounds very, very close to something else, right? And we know that the Pentagon gives technical support and allows Hollywood to use equipment in exchange for the ability to rewrite scripts. And so, you know, and since the invasion, we've seen all kinds of insane things going on. It's almost like they created a new form of racism. I mean, I guess, you know, Russians have always sort of been, I think maybe, you know, the rest of Europe consider Russians the lesser Europeans or something. But, you know, recently it's gone into really full force. Wimbledon, the tennis organization, decided to ban all Russian tennis players. European countries are halting visas for Russians. Russian pianist Alexander Malafeev, who said he was against the war in Ukraine, had his tour canceled across Canada. Russian Orthodox churches in Canada have been attacked, as well as in Auckland, New Zealand, with graffiti saying "go home" and things like this. So, you know, so we have now in our country very well planned by, you know, the three-letter agencies, you know, the NSA, CIA, you know, FBI, and also the Pentagon, in collusion with our, you know, private media. We have, you know, we have public broadcasting, but it's not really state-controlled media. But the private media that's officially not state-controlled is getting, you know, fed directly information from the CIA and the Pentagon, and they report it as truth. You know, they report it totally uncritically. So that's the situation now, and now we're seeing, you know, people with putting Ukraine flags outside of their house, and saying we need to donate money to Ukraine. And if you bring up that NATO and the United States have been involved in this, or are really responsible for the tension, you're called Putin's puppet, and you are, you know, a traitor to your country, and all this stuff. And it's not even, Ukraine isn't even our country. You know, the United States is our country. So, you know, so it's been pretty absurd, actually, the war hysteria that and how quickly people have really sort of just fallen for it.
Crimea in the years of Americans' occupation or return to native harbor?
So, yeah, Crimea, without zooming out too much, so Crimea was part of Russia since 1783, right? But then it became part of the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic during the USSR period. And then so after 91, when the Soviet Union split up, Crimea continued to be part of Ukraine. But so then following the 2014 coup, there was a referendum, and 95% of the mostly Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian population voted in favor of rejoining the Russian Federation. Now, this was seen as an invasion. They called it an invasion of sovereign territory. They called it a illegal annexation. In the Western media, totally ignoring the fact that there was a referendum where 95% of the people voted to join Russia. So the President Obama gave a speech around that time, and he said some kind of very hypocritical things. So he said the 21st century is a century where borders will not be redrawn by force. But the year before the 20th century was 1999, when the US led a NATO invasion, dropped 23,000 bombs on Serbia to pry loose Kosovo. They redrew those borders by force, right? 1999, that was the year before the 21st century. Obama compared, in his speech in 2014, Obama compared Crimea and Russian activity in Crimea in supporting the referendum and having troops there. He said it was a far greater evil than what happened in Iraq, even though he opposed the Iraq war, he said. Well, almost 1 million Iraqis died, So, I mean, just looking at body count, how is that a far greater evil, right? I think he's engaging in American exceptionalism here, right? Rules for you, but not for me. So the narrative here also is that the Crimean people had no voice, right? That it was a power play by Putin and the Russian government. But in 2014, the Western powers and Russia had negotiated an agreement in February, and Russia was totally willing to abide by those agreements, but the United States chose instead to support the fascist overthrow of Ukraine, and so it really invalidated any agreement between the United States and Russia. So it's really hypocritical to say, for the United States to say that, Russia annexing Crimea is a greater crime, when you all you have to do is look at the recent history of the United States and see, that really United States has lost all legitimacy as far as a rules-based world order. They've made it clear that, the rules don't apply to the United States. So.
The participation of American imperialism is fueling anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine. Ideology, military contribution of the United States to Ukraine politics after 2013.
Oh yeah, okay. We talked about this a little bit already in the first question, but I'll mention a little bit more about this. So in terms of America fueling Russophobia within Ukraine, USAID and Western NGOs have been pushing Russophobia for a long time. I mean, this really goes all the way back to after World War II. Operation Gladio was a CIA operation where they established stay-behind units, which were fascist militias in countries that had been formerly occupied by fascists or had been formerly fascist. So it started in Italy. That's why it's called Operation Gladio, but then expanded to other countries. And so there was activity in Poland and in Ukraine. So really, I mean, the United States meddling in Ukraine's politics really goes back that far to the end of World War II. So in 2014, during the Maidan when the Maidan situation was in progress, the U.S. diplomat Victoria Nuland, who is currently just in the current administration today, still in the Biden administration. But she was famously, you know, did a photo op handing out cookies to protesters. There was John McCain, the senator, was also showed up at the Maidan protest. And then later, Nuland was heard on a phone saying, you know, this is our guy. This is the guy we want for president of Ukraine, right? So caught red-handed, you know, meddling in another country's affairs. Then, you know, the war in Donbass broke out. Pro-Russian separatists declared their independence. And so that's when the Azov battalion was sent in. And so, but the connection with the United States there is that the CIA was funding, was training the Azov battalion. And the CIA had been in Ukraine since 2015, giving covert training to these fascist militias. Actually today, let's see, what was it? The United States provides like a huge percentage of Ukraine's military funding. Like it's like 90% is from the US. So, you know, clearly the United States is not neutral in this, and they are very much involved, you know. And prior to the 2014 coup, there had been sort of a pro-Russian government, and then there was like a pro-West, pro-EU government, pro-Russian, pro-EU. And the coup just totally shut that down. And there's no opportunity. And in fact, now, since the invasion, any pro-Russian party has been outlawed. Since 2014, the communist parties were outlawed in Ukraine as part of their decommunization law. But yeah, now even any pro-Russian party is outlawed.
Nazi battalions in the USA is American society in the media aware of the reality of their existence?
Interesting thing about this is that people were aware. So in 2014, it was, they downplayed it, but they did acknowledge the existence, at least, of Svoboda and right sector in the government. And also, you know, again, when reporting on the situation in the Donbass region, the New York Times sort of talked about the heroes defending Mariupol and the courageous Azov battalion, right? But other newspapers criticized them for that, actually. So there was an awareness that there were definitely neo-Nazi elements, but it was downplayed. It was, and I would say at that time, early, you know, after the coup, you know, there were like people from Svoboda and right sector like high up in government, and many of them resigned like a few months after. But I mean, but Zelensky was elected as sort of a neutral guy, right? He was kind of going to be the one that would sort of make peace with Russia. And when he went to Donbass and met with the Azov leaders, they basically told him, no, we're not going to be, you know, we're not going to stop shelling, you know, Donetsk and Luhansk. I mean, we're just going to do that. You're just going to have to deal with it, you know? So, but you know, now it's again really kind of disappointing and really strange how historical memory can be so easily erased. I mean, even in 2015, the U.S. House of Representatives acknowledged that the Azov Battalion is a neo-Nazi party. They passed a bipartisan amendment to the Defense Appropriations Act that said that they could not send weapons to explicitly neo-Nazi militias, including Azov Regiment, which they named by name. However, later that same year, the Senate passed a spending bill that did not include that amendment. And now, they've totally scrapped any concept of not sending weapons to Azov. Facebook was apparently aware that Azov was a neo-Nazi battalion because they didn't allow Azov battalion propaganda on Facebook until February 25th, 2022. And then they reversed their ban on praise for Azov battalion. So people were aware, they've just chosen to forget.
Assessment of the Russian special military operation by the American media, government, and society. Do public sentiments diverge from official propaganda? How is the American Lend-Lease society assist for Ukraine?
Yeah. So at first, the U.S. media was reporting that Russia was losing the war. There were a lot of myths surrounding the early days of the war in February and March. One I remember was like the ghost of Kiev, which was supposed to be this flying ace that was credited with shooting down 6 Russian planes and everything. That turned out to be totally false. The footage of Ghost of Kiev that was going around was totally computer generated. Another thing that I can't claim to know all the answers here, but the Bucha massacre, that's what they call it, the Bucha massacre, was strange. So Bucha was where the Russians had come in and occupied the city, and Azov, and then the Russians left and Azov came in, and Azov was posting videos of bodies being stacked up. All the people supposedly they found dead, but the strange thing about it was that the bodies had white armbands, and the white was meant to show that the people sided with Russia, and the blue armband showed that the people sided with Ukraine. So and there was also, Azov posted a video showing a soldier asking his commander, "I see a lot of white, okay to shoot?" So so it's hard to know with these things. The fog of war it always obscures, a reasonable view. We see through a glass darkly. But if you're critical, you can see holes in the official story oftentimes. So, I mean, the U.S. government, as far as I see it, the U.S. government and NATO, they don't want to see an end to bloodshed in Ukraine. They're using the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder, essentially, in a proxy war against Russia. They see the war as politically advantageous. They see it as legitimizing U.S. domination of the world. It's enriching the military-industrial complex. I think they've sent $47 billion now to Ukraine. Most of it, going straight to Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and the weapons manufacturers, you know. So it's been a big payday for them. And, you know, the way I see this situation, it could end, the war in Ukraine could end today if the United States and Zelensky agreed to sit down at the negotiating table and agreed that Ukraine would be a neutral country. And I do think at this point, probably some concession of land in the Donbass region, I think is probably going to be necessary for a diplomatic result at this point. The war's not in the American people's interest, and people know it. The Democrats are not going to do well in the election, in the midterm elections coming up in November. I don't know. I probably shouldn't make predictions. I have no idea what's going to happen, but it really looks like the Democrats aren't going to do well. Actually, you know, ironically, the anti-war sentiment within the establishment has been coming from the right wing, and far right politicians like Congressperson Marjorie Taylor Greene. She gave a speech saying that we can send billions to Ukraine, but we don't have formula to feed our babies. There was a formula shortage earlier this year in the United States, right? So we can send all this money to Ukraine, but there's things that we need here, you know, and people are suffering here. A former representative, Tulsi Gabbard, said the American people are paying the cost of weapons and sanctions. The sanctions regime has really backfired on the United States, and actually our economy is suffering because of it. It was meant to make Russia's economy suffer, you know, but you know, gas prices are sky high. Inflation is sky high. It rose the most it ever has in 40 years recently. And that's a tax on the American people, you know, when we can't afford to fill our gas tank to go to work, and we can't afford to feed ourselves because grocery prices are sky high, you know, that's a tax on us. And so this war is making the American people suffer, you know, and our support of neo-Nazis and you know, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, they're not all neo-Nazis, and you know, maybe, you know, there are Ukrainians that have a good point, you know, about the situation, but you know, it's not, the cost of it is not worth it for the American people. So,
what are these events? Imperialist conflicts, the national struggle of Ukraine's, the split of the world, and two powers, an American and Chinese, or something else. What should the communists do in this situation? The USA, Russia, and other.
So there's several parts to this question. I think I'll start with the national struggle of Ukrainians. One of the things Putin said in his speech announcing the invasion was that it was a mistake for Lenin and Stalin to give Ukraine self-determination. And I would emphatically disagree with that. I mean, one of the best things about the Soviet Union was its stand on the national issue. And Russia is a prison house of nations. But the Soviet Union really sought to give self-determination to the federated republics. So part of a federation part of a federal system that respects national self-determination is respecting the right to divorce. And so, you know, so if the Ukrainian people decide that they want to have sovereignty rather than autonomy in a federated republic, they have the right to do that, right? I do also think, we had a multipolar world before World War I, and it was unstable, and it resulted in the First World War. So I've heard a lot of people saying that multipolarism is what we need, but I think it's more important that we have international solidarity of the working class. And we should remember that, our loyalty, our primary loyalty as communists should be to the working class and not to any country, not to any nation. We also want to avoid increasingly volatile rivalries between capitalist countries that may lead to nuclear war. We certainly do not want, a disastrous situation, like we had in the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So checks and balances on power are good, but Russia and China, I think, don't want aggression. They're not imperialist countries, right? Russia and China want friendly competition, not aggression and world war. So I think the US is increasingly isolating itself internationally with its reckless unilateral behavior. It's becoming increasingly a world where cooperation is necessary. And so that's why it's really, really ironic when the United States says it wants a rules-based world order, because that's exactly what it's been violating for, the past 100 years. In 1919, Lenin expressed a desire to get along with the United States. He told the Chicago Daily News in October 1919, "We are decidedly for an economic understanding with America, with all countries, but especially with America." So we want cooperation, and we want the world to not become an increasingly volatile, increasingly hostile, increasingly violent place. Although I would say, and we always get browbeaten into saying this in the United States, but I didn't support the invasion. And my party, the PSL, holds this stance too. But it's important to note. So we don't support the invasion, but we reserve our strongest condemnation for the US government, which rejected Russia's legitimate security concerns in the region with total intransigence, and they knew that they could provoke such a war. So that's a consequence of decades of US NATO bullying and humiliation of Russia. So I think there are three clear principles that we can use as an international communist movement that wants to be independent and that does not support any capitalist parties, but supports, the unity of the working class. So number one, NATO and the US are the primary aggressors. They've shown this has been their history since the existence of NATO, of course, and especially since 1991, since NATO has expanded so much, right? So they are the primary aggressors. And, we communists in the United States, we hold our government responsible because they're sending these weapons in our names, So number one, NATO and US are the primary aggressors. Number two, uphold the UN Charter. International law, a rules-based world order is a good thing. The problem is that the United States doesn't follow the rules. The United States thinks that they can make the rules and they don't have to follow them. So, but the UN Charter, was an attempt to get all countries to agree on certain parameters in order to avoid war, and especially nuclear war. It was at a time when nuclear war was a threat that was really present in people's minds. Right? So diplomacy, international cooperation, we always want to encourage that rather than war, rather than bombs, right? All right, number 3, practice anti-fascism, oppose anti-communism. And that's why we can never see, even if we don't see any good side of this war, we can never see the Ukraine side as the good side, because the fascist militias, the decommunization law, the Bandera Day, the Bandera statues, no communist should support any of these things, right? So 3 principles: NATO and US are aggressors, uphold the UN Charter, practice anti-fascism, oppose anti-communism. And finally, as a final word on this, I want to say real quickly what the effect that sanctions have had, what the effect of sanctions has been on the people of the United States. The cost of living is rising in the United States under the pressure of inflation. We need major social programs right now to shield the working class from the worst of this crisis. But ruling class politicians, all they care about is their proxy war and profits for weapons manufacturers. Workers of the US are still feeling the effects of mishandling of the pandemic. We are having to choose between paying rent or mortgage and feeding ourselves and our families. We're unable to afford access to medical care. The Biden administration has made promises to help us with all of these situations, and they have done none of it. Public schools throughout the country are struggling. The US government has no desire to end this crisis, and they have no desire to end the war. In fact, the emergency action they've taken has not been emergency action to help the American people. It's been emergency action to deepen the war and increase the body count and increase the bloodshed. So, thank you for having me.
Thank you, dear comrade. I'm very pleased that there is a clear understanding, despite the different place of residence, different countries, different languages, different culture. All of us as communists understand each other's problem, aspirations, and fears.